Polarized training. When looking at how high-level athletes train, it turns out that these athletes have a particular intensity distribution. Research shows that roughly a distribution of 80% easy workouts, endurance training, and 20% hard workouts, intervals, is a distribution that is very common. Why is that? A lot of people would like to increase their FTP, and for this it seems logical to train a lot on your FTP. But just training on your FTP is not the only way, and certainly not the best way to improve your functional threshold power. To explain this, we first need to take a step back and discuss a few basic principles from modern training theory. When the intensity of a workout increases, the body starts to use more carbohydrates as their main energy source. This use leads to a higher lactate concentration. Eventually, two lactate thresholds are hit. The first is the point where your lactate concentration starts rising above the resting value. Often this is around 2 millimoles of lactate, and this point is called the aerobic threshold. The second threshold is your functional threshold power, or anaerobic threshold. At the second point, the production and absorption of lactate are precisely in balance. Above it, there will be a surplus in the lactate production, which causes an athlete to hit a wall. In theory, the FTP is the maximum intensity you can hold for 60 minutes. In reality, this is not entirely true, and there are large individual differences in how long you can ride at your anaerobic threshold. We don't want to overcomplicate things here and assume for now that your FTP is a good estimate of your anaerobic threshold. We need to look at the 3-zone model, because based on these two thresholds you can determine the 3-zone model. This model is often used in scientific studies to index the intensity of a workout. For example, the zones below aerobic threshold, between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold, and above the anaerobic threshold. These are clearly different zones than the 5 or 8 model zones. The 80-20 rule for polarized training, or the polarized training distribution. This means that they train a lot below the aerobic threshold, zone 1, and a lot above the anaerobic threshold, zone 3. So there's almost no training done between the aerobic and the anaerobic threshold. Almost 80% of the training was at a low intensity, below the aerobic threshold, and 10 to 20% of the training was above the anaerobic threshold. This does not mean that 10 to 20% of the total training time was done in zone 3, but rather that 10 to 20% of the total amount of training sessions contained zone 3 intervals. As a result of these findings, a lot of further research has been done on this method of classifying training sessions and its effectiveness. This was done for many different sports at all kinds of levels and yielded interesting results. Recreational cyclists also showed that most improvement in their functional threshold power, even when they trained only for 6 hours a week, from a polarized training distribution, compared to training plans that spend more time in between the aerobic and the anaerobic threshold. To explain why polarized training works may not even be that complicated. Training on your anaerobic threshold is very exhausting, but you don't use all your muscle groups at this intensity, and you don't get the maximum out of your heart-lung system. So you do get quite tired, but the training stimulus is less intensive than shorter cycling above your anaerobic threshold. That's why it's better to make sure you put a maximum load on the whole system and build up less fatigue, so you can do that more often. So if you want to improve your FTP, it is very important that you look at the intensity of your workouts. Most recreational cyclists ride their easy rides too intensively, but their hard rides are not hard enough. Often because they are still tired of that easy ride that was actually a little bit too hard. So train like a pro by doing polarized training. So how to get better? Getting better is all about timing. There are actually no good or bad workouts, there is only a bad combination or a wrong workout at the wrong time. The path towards progress is therefore a training plan with the right training stimulus at the right time, taking into account your level, your goal and your available time. Also take into account that for well-trained athletes with a high aerobic threshold, it is actually pretty hard to train above their aerobic threshold. Also, getting the training intensity distribution right is not the only ingredient of a good training plan. In a scientific zone 1, there is still a lot of variation possible, depending on the goal and also the training history.